everyone. Welcome to 80s TV Ladies, Episode 1, the podcast that takes you on a journey to the fabulous television past. I'm Susan Lambert-Haddam, an indie writer and producer who once competed in a rodeo, cutting cows, if you can believe it.
And I'm Sharon Johnson, Susan's co-pilot. I'm a television and podcast enthusiast with no rodeo experience. On 80s TV Ladies, we'll be examining beloved female-driven TV shows of the 1980s.
With a few sidebars to the 70s and 90s. And who knows what else we'll talk about, because we tend to get off track sometimes.
Every now and then.
On this podcast, we're going to talk about everything from our childhood to Jacqueline Smith's fashion line. But mostly we'll be talking about television shows from 1980 to 1989. So today we will be looking at a type of show they made a lot in the 80s, don't make so much anymore, the action comedy. It's also not one of the most incredibly super, because I like to start like off in the weeds a little bit. So not a hugely super famous 80s show like Golden Girls or Remington Steele, but I think people that didn't even see those shows know about those shows. But a beloved show with a very strong fan base, and one that's very close to my heart, Scarecrow and Mrs. King.
And you can count me amongst one of those people that didn't watch it, but definitely knew of it. It was created by Eugenie Ross Lemming and Brad Buckner.
Scarecrow and Mrs. King was an action comedy that premiered October 3rd, 1983. The pilot episode was entitled The First Time. It was written by Eugenie Ross Lemming and Brad Buckner and directed by Rod Holcomb.
It starred Kate Jackson and Bruce Boxleitner and ran 4 seasons on CBS from 1983 to 1987. It also starred Beverly Garland, Mel Stewart, and Martha Smith. And the guest cast in the pilot included John Saxon and Kate Reid.
I love John Saxon. He's
Me too.
in everything. In the 80s, he was the man.
Absolutely.
The pilot script for Scarecrow and Mrs. King was entitled The First Time, which I thought was kind of cute, because it was the first time they met, and it's the first pilot. And so I do know that Kate Jackson was a huge star coming off of Charlie's Angels, one of the biggest shows in the 70s. And she kind of had her pick of projects. The rumor was that she was looking for a comedy because she wanted to do something very different from Charlie's Angels. But then she read the script and really liked it and suddenly decided that's what she wanted to do.
Well, and it's a very different character than what she played in Charlie's Angels, what she was most known for. She's now a suburban mom with 2 kids, divorced, just sort of living her life, and then it gets inadvertently dragged into this world of spies and spycraft. I mean, it's a very very big shift from what she was known for her to look at something like this. I can see why she would be interested.
Yeah. And I think what we've done is jump over something because, again, we're still learning ourselves. So we didn't even explain to people what the show really is. I just realized. But it's fine. You guys are fine. You're fine.
Because maybe you may already know that based on the fact that you're here. So.
If you're listening, that's the only people listening is the people who love Scarecrow and Mrs. King.
But anyway, it's probably a good idea just in case to just talk a little bit about what the show's about.
Yes.
So Mrs. King, as played by Kate Jackson, as I mentioned, is a suburban divorced mother of 2 who finds herself working with a spy in a pseudo CIA government agency.
An unnamed The Agency.
That's right. And his code name is Scarecrow, hence the title of the show. What happens in the pilot is she has dropped her boyfriend off at the train station. He's at the train station running away from some people who are trying to get a hold of the box that he has in hand. The package, yes. Package. And he, in trying to evade them, he runs into her, literally begs her to take this package and just hand it to somebody in a red hat on the train. That's all he wants her to do. And then he runs off, and she sees him being accosted by these people who are chasing him. And then things happen from there that get her pulled deeper and deeper into this this situation.
Well, it's going to be a comedy when she steps onto the train, and looks down the train car, and it is a sea of guys in red fezzes.
Yes.
And so she doesn't know who to give the package to. Of course, it happens all the time. But it's a lovely moment, and we get to see, like, basically Kate Jackson, be very, like, again, it's very Katharine Hepburn in Baby. What's the tiger one or the panther one?
Not Bringing Up Baby.
Bringing Up Baby.
Okay.
It's very Katharine Hepburn in Bringing Up Baby, where she's scattered and.
But at the same time, she's clearly, she's a stereotypical divorced mom of two and living in the suburbs. But she starts showing how resourceful she can be through the course of this episode too. That she's not just this sort of dim bulb sitting over in the corner. That she let things happen to her. She's able to kind of step up and try to solve problems. Which is nice to see. So,
but the show also starred Beverly Garland as as Amanda King's mother, who lives with her since the divorce, and Mel Stewart as her boss, Billy Melrose, and Martha Smith as the kind of dismissive other female agent, Francine Desmond. One of the things that I like about the show was that there was another woman in the show, and that other woman, though they definitely had a little bit of she had a snarky reaction to the housewife, they ultimately kind of become friends and co-workers, and they easily could have not had that, and they easily could have taken that in a very less interesting. They didn't quite take it as interesting as you would now in the show. I think they just didn't even know what they had kind of on the table of that. One of the things I love about the show was that she was divorced and with two kids. My mom at the time that the show started was divorced with two kids. And so that sort of resonated. My mom also worked for Centers of Disease Control. She was a microbiologist. So she worked for the federal government. It was not a secret like it is in the show. So in the show, she keeps her secret government agency job from her family, and her family does not know that she is, they think she's going out to do her dog walking job and various other jobs. Covers.
Yes.
The cover for the agency is a film company that makes documentaries around the world, about, crickets. And so that's the cover for why they have to, oh my God, we're going to be in the editing room late. Oh my gosh, we have to go on location. So that's the excuse for the spy stuff they have to go do. So this chance meeting spins her life in a whole other direction, and she takes it like that. Now, I think that's the other thing is this really is a female-driven show. It is really about Amanda King's choices in this show and her discovering that she wants to be both a mom and make a difference.
There are several times in the pilot even where she says, I'm looking for a job. Is there anything? So she definitely wasn't saying, thanks very much, I'm going to go on with my life and you guys do whatever you do. She was like, there was already like a seed was planted with this door being open to this world she wasn't familiar with, but she obviously found intriguing enough to want to stay in it. So,
all right, and then I am, of course, a big fan of romantic comedies, and Bruce Boxleitner and Kate Jackson, I think, are very cute together in as these two, as Scarecrow and Mrs. King. Although a little bit like Lee Stetson's very upset that he has to deal with this housewife. Who is sort of barging into the case more than he expected her to. So, of course, it starts off with but I don't even like you. Now I have to work with you. So, in one of the things that was fascinating to me in reading the original script, and again, I found this online at a website that, again, I'm also going to shout out later, So I assume it's pretty legit. It seems pretty legit. There's several drafts of the first pilot online, which is really unusual to be able to find for a show from the 80s. And what's interesting, one of the biggest changes is that she was married to the dean. So in the original pilot script, she was actually married and having this secret life begin. And I don't know what was happening to that. Which I thought was kind of huge because it makes it not as exciting or fun. It makes it a little bit creepy.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they thought they could maintain that for the length of a series that you were hoping would run multiple seasons, because essentially you're asking her to lie to her husband constantly.
Yeah, and I think that was a really good change. So a lot of times, like the script will come in, they're like, oh, we love the script, but we're going to change this and this and this. And sometimes those changes may not make the show better, but I think this one did.
Definitely.
Because it made her available. They gave her this boyfriend at the start of the show, which is interesting because you never see him. So they did this gag in the pilot where they're shooting over the shoulder of the boyfriend, or they're shooting, like you don't get to see him. He's behind the couch. Again, you sort of get why they're doing it, but it's something that works better sort of on the page than on the stage, as it were,
Yes.
because it feels awkward. Like it feels really awkward. You're like, why are they not showing us this dude? He can be, and he's a weather guy, he's a weatherman, and he's sort of not very exciting. And she clearly knows that he's stable and a good guy, and will stick around, but it's clear that her mother's more interested in her pursuing that relationship than Amanda King is interested in pursuing that relationship. So that's also but it was sort of also interesting to sort of like, she clearly had this romantic relationship already in her life. Mm-hmm. It may not have been the romantic relationship. The other thing that I think is really interesting, we don't know this at the top of the show or even for the first season, really. There's no divorced husband around for the pilot. He's just gone somewhere. But another interesting thing over the course of the show that I saw and noticed, she doesn't talk bad about him.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah. He's just not in their day-to-day life, and in the way that maybe, you could easily just assume he sees the kids on the weekends or holidays or whatever their divorce called for. But yeah, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily expect that he would be there every morning at breakfast and dinner since they're divorced. So it made perfect sense to me, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but it's interesting because you wouldn't do that now. In a television show, if you would make more dramatic choices for these other characters in the show than they make. And I think that was very 80s. The main characters got the drama, but it wasn't like, oh, and then they do later bring in, I'm going to spoiler alert, later in seasons, they bring in the ex-husband. It becomes a little bit of drama, but not much. Mm-hmm. What was interesting is how little, that was just who she was at the start of the show. She's divorced with 2 kids, but it was also not played for a lot of drama. She needs a job because she doesn't have enough money. That sort of,
yeah. And perhaps that was one of the choices that they made because to keep him kind of off the stage, if you will, because they didn't, maybe they felt they'd have to create some sort of drama around the ex-husband, and this is a comedy. So it's probably just easier just to leave him out of the picture, and just everybody just assumes he sees the kids at other times other than when we're dipping into her life. And her mom is used as kind of the person that's kind of like, you're going where? You're doing what? Are you going to be late for this? Kind of thing.
Yeah. The other thing is that's funny is her mom is used basically to assure the audience that her kids are okay when she's off.
Right.
Around
Somebody's saving the world for the kids.
Like she's like, oh, you can pick up the kids. Mom is there to hold down the fort, literally, so that she can go off and save the world. But I have to give a shout out to Beverly Garland, who's amazing. She's a great actress, classic movies, TV star. The joke being is that I want to point out that Remington Steele started a year before, 2 years before. I'm going to have to go look that up. Started just before Scarecrow and Mrs. King. And in Remington Steele, Beverly Garland plays the mom of Laura Holt.
I forgot about that.
Which is very funny when she walks out and is, again, slightly different character, but basically the mom of our lead actress, detective / spy. And we were like literally, I was like, okay, this was her audition. Like this, they saw this and they were like, oh my God, you know who we need to get to be Amanda's mom? Beverly Garland. By the way, never occurred to me that the Beverly Garland Hotel was related to the actress Beverly Garland.
Really?
But it is.
Yeah, of course. Yes, it is.
I don't know why I didn't put it together. I know in Hollywood, so in Los Angeles, there's a Beverly Garland Hotel, and it's been there for decades.
Yeah.
And I knew it existed, and literally it never occurred to me that it was named after the actress and built for her by her husband, who clearly loved her very much, and built her a hotel. So Beverly Garland plays the mom of all spies and detectives in television. And Eugenie Ross Lemming actually started as an actress and a comedian. She started with Second City, which I also didn't know till I started researching this, which was very exciting because, again, Scarecrow and Mrs. King has a lot of comedy in it. And so she started as a comedy writer and a comedy actress. And in fact, she was with the Second City team along with Harold Ramis and John Belushi, which is again, for me, those are like, oh my God, she worked with masters and ran with the wolves, so that I'm very excited.
Well, it's another example of how there's not one path for anything in this business in particular, that those they started in the same place, but certainly didn't end up in the same place. She ended up as a showrunner on television. John Belushi ended up as a comedic god to most of us, and so you just never know where some things are going to lead you, where your talents are going to lead you sometimes.
And I just watched an interview with her from the 90s, and she literally talked about that. She's like, I just wanted to keep making stuff, and that became a way to find a voice, which I thought was really interesting. So, and they've been writing partners, Brad Buckner and her, kind of since she started writing. So the first show that they were on is Mary Hartman back in 1977.
Wow.
But it was 1983 that they wrote a pilot called Scarecrow and Mrs. King, as far as I can tell. And I actually have a copy of that pilot, a script in hand. I'm going to wave my script around. All right, so I think we should take a little break. And we'll come back and then talk more about Kate Jackson, talk more about the pilot the first time, and then about our really. So we're going to do 3 questions, and then we're also going to do But Is It? We're doing a little segment we're going to call But Is It? So we'll be taking a break. Stay with us. We'll be back.
See you soon.
Welcome back to 80s TV Ladies. And we're talking about Scarecrow and Mrs. King. And one thing we haven't really gone into is that it's romantic and sexy. Or I thought so.
Well, definitely. But I have always been of the opinion that men and women that work together on television don't need to have a romance. That always seems to be kind of the direction that the writers like to push things, because the audience, I think, kind of likes it. But for me, it's a double-edged sword in that respect.
Well, for sure. And again, but I think it was completely expected in the 80s that if you had a man and woman working together, that they would be romantically involved, or that there would be at least sexual tension between them. I mean, Remington Steele had launched just before Scarecrow and Mrs. King, and that was basically all that show was about in a lot of ways, that and the cases. But I think this was very classic. It was set up to be a romance as well. And what I enjoyed was that it was also them becoming friends as well as romantic partners.
Yeah, one of the things I was glad about is they took as long as they did to go there, if you will. That it wasn't just from the beginning. Even it seemed like it was headed that way, but you weren't entirely sure, which I kind of appreciated because it gave the Amanda character a chance to learn her way in this new world and figure out what her worth and what she could contribute, and which I really appreciated.
Yeah, they actually really, I think the pilot did a good job actually of setting up like their personalities in such a way that you knew like there was potential both for their friendship, their partnership, and a romantic relationship. And I think it really balanced that out. There's a scene at the Lincoln Memorial, and it's very cute. She's like, "What are you doing for Thanksgiving? Do you have a place to go? Are you okay? Are you like, you seem so alone?" He's like, "I'm a loner. Leave me alone." But it's very sweet. There's a real sweetness to the Amanda King character that everybody sort of bristles about in the agency world, but ultimately ends up being kind of her superpower, is that she sort of, the naivete that she brings to it is the ability, enables her to see things that the rest of them can't see because they're so jaded and spy agency guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, she brought a lot to the table, and I think things that she didn't really understand or know that she had to offer as well. And that was part of it. And I liked that they gave her a chance to speak up and, you know, speak her thoughts and really contribute to solving a number of the cases that they came up with, which was great. So
yeah, so we'll get into when we start looking at season 1, which will be next time, our next time, as opposed to the first time. Look at that! Look what I did there with the pilot. But we'll talk about some of my favorite episodes in season 1, and which one I think is sort of the penultimate episode of the show for me. Maybe Sharon's going to have to pick one, and my imagination is going to be different from mine. But I really liked when they, you know, sort of kind of like worked really well together, but were also themselves, like very strongly. Like the Amanda King character was like, well, this is how I do things. And the Lee Stetson character was like, well, I don't do things that way, but this is how I do things. And when both of their strengths came together, that was when the show sort of shined the most. And for me, also, what became more later in the seasons, I think they really perfected it. Probably in later season 1, season 2, was sort of these little buttons at the end of the episode that were really mostly about them. And that's what I lived for, is those little character buttons where they were cute, either buddies or sexual tension. So that is my favorite. And I'm a big fan of both these stars. So like Kate Jackson, totally big fan of hers. Bruce Boxleitner, totally big fan of his. And I think, again, they both sort of found a show where they could shine together in a way that was pretty unique for the time.
Oh, absolutely. I know that there was Remington Steele, but that was a different kind of relationship, if you will. But even though there was in this show there was some, and even in this pilot there was some indication of or dismissiveness of her suburban housewifeness, it was never as dismissive as perhaps you might think it could have been at the time. There was underneath it maybe just kind of a, okay, it was more of a, you're inexperienced, not you're stupid. You know, what do you know? And I think that was one of the strengths of the show.
Yeah, for sure. Although in some of those early first season, you're like, okay, he's a little angry at her. That's not nice. But I think that was because like the Amanda King character was so nice. And again, I think even looking back, that still resonates for me. And one of the things that I felt like, oh, here's this person who is actually not your typical spy or female detective character. You know, Laura Holt in Remington Steele is very tough. Her whole point is, I can do it. I always wanted to do this. This is what I wanted to do, and I can do it as good as a man. And in fact, I do it as a man, in some ways, a man I invented, and nobody knows that he's invented. And then this guy walks in, right? So the whole premise of that show is she is tough, and she is a detective, and she is up for that job. And this is a woman who kind of felt like, oh, I'm a mom and I'm a housewife and I'm going to live this life. And then her life got turned upside down, and she sort of discovers what she wants to do, and discovers that she can be both.
Right.
And that is actually still even unusual, that you can have both in this world. Like it actually, to me, I look at something like Parks and Rec, and in some ways there's a parallel for me looking at a show like Parks and Rec, where Leslie Knope is perky and sweet and driven, but ultimately is very much her own woman, and a somewhat untraditional woman in a business environment, and yet is able to sort of bring all that home for herself and be incredibly successful, and also true to kind of her sweetness. And those characters really appeal to me.
Yeah, I like that they didn't force her to lose that sense of herself where, as you said, she's a nice person. Yeah. She was still a nice person at the end, despite all the things she'd experienced and the things that she'd seen, the things that had happened. She still approached things from the standpoint of, I'm going to treat people well. You know?
Yeah, and I'm going to assume the best of them, even those Russian spies. A lot of Russian spies in this show, because it was 1983. So yeah, and the show, you know, we'll get into it later. The show definitely takes a little Reagan-y, you know, kind of. It's got some Reagan in the background. Because he was our president.
Yes, he was.
At the time. But I want to also talk about Bruce Boxleitner, because I was a fan. One of the reasons I watched the show was for him. Bruce Boxleitner, the star of Tron, also the star, for me again, the other place that I knew Bruce Boxleitner from was Kenny Rogers' The Gambler, the TV movies. But he also starred in How the West Was Won, which was a television show. And right before this, he had done a show called Bring 'Em Back Alive. That was sort of clearly inspired by sort of the Indiana Jones phenomenon. And there was another show that same season that was another, like, you know, Ride 'em Buck, something that, you know, was again sort of the sort of great white hunter, explorer, Indiana Jonesy kind of show. But that was not a successful show, so I think I was really glad when he showed up in Scarecrow and Mrs. King.
I don't think I was really familiar with him before Scarecrow and Mrs. King, which, as I think I mentioned earlier, I did not watch, but was aware of, because, again, there were only 3 networks at the time. It was almost impossible not to at least be somewhat aware of some of the other shows. So I didn't bring that into the show, although, of course, like everybody else who watched television, I was aware of Kate Jackson. So...
Well, and Kate Jackson, we'll do a deep dive on Kate Jackson later, but again, not only was she coming off Charlie's Angels, but some of the stuff that I didn't quite realize, even though I was somewhat aware of her earlier shows, but she had starred in Dark Shadows, and then The Rookie, and with The Rookie, she became super famous. Like, she had the most fan mail for that show than any of the other people on the show.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
By the end of that show. So basically, when it came time to do Charlie's Angels, which was originally called The Alley Cats, it was developed for Kate Jackson to star in. She apparently renamed the show. She said, Alley Cats is dumb. I don't think she said that, but she was like, no, it should be called Harry's Angels. And then from there, they ended up with Charlie's Angels. But she also sort of made the show, like, wanted different things from that show, which is, from what I hear, made it a better show. Now, we can talk about whether it was a good show or not later. But, and she got to pick the character she played. She was originally supposed to play Kelly. And at fairly later in development, she decided she wanted to play Sabrina. And then Jacqueline Smith came in to play Kelly. But here's the thing. So I was a little fascinated by Scarecrow and Mrs. King because it was the first show that I saw female names as executive producer, as showrunner. And that made an impact as somebody that was interested in film and TV. I was like, I took notice. I remember sort of going, oh, and I am hard pressed to find some other female showrunners in the 80s. So I did a little research.
I guess it's not surprising that finding many would be difficult, because it still was, and certainly not as much now, but very much like most businesses, very male dominated. So
yes, and I was surprised again that even by the 80s, it was such an unusual thing to see a female showrunner. What I will say, so I did a little research. The very first, what they're calling the very first female showrunner, was Gertrude Berg, who was an actress and writer and producer, and created a radio show called Rise of the Goldbergs, which later became known just as the Goldbergs. And it was a sort of domestic comedy family show about a Jewish family in the Bronx. And she starred in the show as the matriarch of that show, and that was incredibly popular. She won a Tony and an Emmy Award for Best Actress.
Wow.
And again, it was first a radio show from 1929 to 1946, and then it was a television show from 1949 to 1956. Now, there were also shows that, like, a Betty White ran, like, kind of not necessarily talk shows, but that variety show. But it wasn't until 20 years later that apparently the next female showrunner appeared. Charlotte Sue Brown was an American writer, producer, and director. And so I'm going to call her the first female showrunner who didn't star in the show of primetime network television. And she ran Rhoda, the spinoff for the Mary Tyler Moore Show. She was a protege of the creator of Mary Tyler Moore, James Brooks. Thank you. I did get there, and had her first writing job on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And then she worked for shows like Doris Day and Partridge Family. And then she came back on as a writer on Rhoda when they spun off, and then stayed on the show and worked her way up from writer, producer to executive producer.
That's great.
So that was my little research dive into the first female showrunners. But that was, again, pretty late in the television game. 20 years, waiting 20 years for your next first female showrunner.
Yeah, no question. But on some level, not surprising, I suppose, because it's kind of astonishing what Gertrude Berg was able to do back at that time. And the feminist movement really didn't start taking off until the late 60s, early 70s. So it takes a while sometimes for things to trickle down up through to get to a point where things start to change and start to happen. So I wish I could say I were more surprised, but I don't. As I think about it, I don't think I am.
Yeah.
I don't think I am. So
yeah, it's a long time between trains sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
For women. All right. So that question maybe brings us to one of the questions we're going to ask you on the show. But is it? And we're going to look at Scarecrow and Mrs. King. And we're going to ask this question when we're done looking at Scarecrow and Mrs. King. We want to say, but is it a feminist show? It's female driven, but is it a feminist show?
I think it is. Especially because Amanda King, as I said before, she's a suburban mom. She's got kids and decides to start down this professional road that sort of fell into her lap, that she never really thought about as something that might be a career for herself, and jumped into it with both feet and worked really hard at it and was very successful at it. And from that standpoint, I think absolutely it is. She was a door open for her and she ran through it. So good for her.
All right. And I'm going to agree with you. I think it is a feminist show, and I think it's one of the reasons I come back to it, and one of the reasons it has a pretty core fan base, that even though it's, again, not the shows that, it may not be in that top 1% of shows, it's a show that I think weirdly holds up in a weird way, but it holds up as a feminist show because it basically stays about her. And even though it's about them and their romance, it's really about, does she get what she wants out of her world? And I think ultimately, both in the pilot and in the show, in the course of the show, she does. And we're following her story, even though we're also obviously following their story. It is Scarecrow and Mrs. King. And again, the time also of the name shows, Hardcastle McCormick,
Simon and Simon.
Simon and Simon.
And on and on.
So Scarecrow
Jake
and
and
Mrs.
the Fat
King.
Man.
Jake and, yeah. Tin Speed and Brown Shoe.
Right.
We could do a whole podcast on the name shows. So yes, I am going to say that it's a feminist show. It's a little, it's got a lot of bumps. There's some missed opportunities for doing more with Francine Desmond, the other spy, and Amanda King. I think that those are two characters that you would now definitely do more with. Even if the show was Scarecrow and Mrs. King. And I think also, again, everybody else sort of learns a little lesson from Mrs. King.
Oh, absolutely. And they begin to trust her and to listen to her, and not, think, oh, she doesn't have anything to offer because she's this suburban housewife.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of that. Now, is it progressive? And do we need to define progressive?
I think we need to define progressive.
How would you define it?
I guess I would say it's progressive because it pushes the genre, if you will, forward. We are seeing a woman in a role that we haven't seen before. It's being successful. That's being respected. So that says that despite what you might think of women who are primarily at home, that they do have something to offer. So in that respect, I think it is progressive, sure.
Yeah, and I'm going to say it's sort of yes and no, which again, I think we're going to end up with a lot of that in the 80s. But the yes, I agree with you on all of that.
Because if you think about where things were in 1983, what women were doing, I mean, just a few years before, women were finally able to get credit cards in their own names without having to have some man in their life sign for it. And here we have this woman who basically is saying, yeah, I did the the normal thing. I got married, and then unfortunately I got divorced. But now this is happening for me, and I want to do this. I'm going to do this. I have things to offer here.
Yeah, and I actually love it's sort of the challenge of the domestic home life versus saving the world. Like, there's a lot of stuff that they do with that, where it's like, I'm still trying to, I've got to fix my flat tire, and get the kids to their dentist. And so this will be very convenient that the office is near their dentist. Like, there's literally, I think, a line in the pilot when she realizes where the office is that it's close to her kid's dentist. And again, I think given that that's what you do as a parent, much less a single parent, you're trying to balance those worlds. And there is a glimpse into that we hadn't seen. We'd seen it in like One Day at a Time. We've seen it in other things, but this was, I'm going to have a challenge. I'm going to choose a challenging career that I want to be a career, and my home and my kids. And in particular, I think that was very exciting to see, and to see be fun and adventurous and not just burdensome. Right. So in that way, I think it was progressive. Still not incredibly progressive on elements of race.
Oh, sure.
Other women roles. So I think a lot of that was pushed by, I'm going to give Kate Jackson credit and the showrunners for pushing that for that lead role. And again, there's a couple of things. There's another thing that's in the pilot script that did not make the aired pilot. That's a line. It's one line. But it was one of those things that spoke to me as like, oh, these showrunners were at least thinking a little bit progressively, these creators. So in the pilot script, when that Lincoln Memorial scene, and she's asking about, she's like, any Mrs. Spy, any little spies, any girlfriends, any boyfriends, is something that Mrs. King asks the spy guy if he has a boyfriend in the pilot script, which for 1983, I'm going to call pretty progressive.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I'm meeting you and I'm, it's not quite asking pronouns, but it's asking, are you gay? What's your personal life like? And it's sort of like completely thrown in there. That line in the pilot, I don't know if they shot it a certain way and then changed it, but it is now any buddies. Any girlfriends, any buddies. So clearly someone between the pilot script, the first pilot script, which got changed a lot, and the aired pilot, that little tiny bit of progressive, like the barest hint of progressiveness kind of got pulled out. And I think there's a lot of that in the script, and certainly in terms of, just there's another episode that's later that I just noticed because it had a black female spy working with Lee Stetson for like a line. She had a line, and she was in this scene with him and did a thing. Oh no, she didn't have a line. She looked like she was going to have a line, and then she didn't. And then they were doing the wrap up of this thing, and she's gone. Like, you're like, wait, but you had her there you certainly had her there for at least an hour. You probably paid her for the day. Couldn't she be in the next scene and have a line? Like, and so that background stuff, which I have to say, it feels like early on they were actually trying to do that. There's a little bit of color in the show. The pilot was shot in Washington, D.C., which I think gives it a nice flavor that you don't usually see in the 80s. Like, you really are like, oh, they're standing in D.C. But yeah, so I'm going to say it's sort of a 5 or 6 on the progressive.
I think for its time it was very progressive. But you're right, as of, for our times, it's
hard not to look at it. But and again, I'm thinking of like, I think One Day, it's not covering issues of importance of the day. So even though, again, that's not what the show was trying to do or even pretending to do, but it is progressive in this one way, but it's not in other ways. So I'm going to say...
fair enough. Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
All right. So what's our next thing? What else are we going to talk about?
Is it time for 3 questions?
3 questions. Okay, yes, let's do 3 questions. All right. Who's going first?
I'll go first. So the first question is...
well, no, first means you have to ask me questions.
Oh, all right. All right. So the first question is...
No, or it means I have to ask you questions. I think that's the first.
Either one is fine.
All right, I'm going to ask you the question. Okay. All right. So what is the 80s ladies-driven TV show that resonated with you?
I'm going to go with Designing Women. It's a show that holds up surprisingly well these days. It has moments that I will remember forever. Most of them are Julia Sugar Baker rants because they're fabulous. And I liked that it was these 4 women working in a business together, making it work, and they were all so different. They all had different things to bring to the table. But it's a great show.
It is a great show. And I remember that aspect of they were friends, but they were also working together. It was a little bit of life goals. Mm-hmm. In that, and I love that show as well. I don't remember it as much, but that is an awesome 80s TV lady show. So then, what is your current shows that are you would consider TV lady show?
I have 2. The first is on network television. Yes, I still watch network television.
Somebody's got to.
I know. And that's me. I'm the one. Grey's Anatomy. I've watched it from day one. Loved it from day one. Have stuck with it through thick and thin. There have been some years it's 18. It's season 18. It's not season all going to be great. Exactly.
Oh my God.
I don't know that we'll ever see a season 18 for anything again. So, but I love it. And the other one you can find on Paramount Plus. It's called The Good Fight. It's a spin-off, if you will, from a show that was on CBS called The Good Wife. It stars the incomparable Christine Baranski, who has been overlooked, deprived of an Emmy for her work on that show for all these years.
She's amazing. She is amazing.
Yeah, it's an incredible show. It's a wonderful, incredible show that goes in places, does things. The showrunners are a married couple, Robert and why can't I think of her name? The Kings is what I usually think of them as.
The Kings.
It's an incredible show, and I highly recommend it. So.
All right, The Good Wife.
Yeah.
It's on my list. I love The Good Wife, and then The Good Fight is on my list. It's literally in my queue, and I watched the first episode and loved it, and then, of course, I haven't gotten around to it because you cannot watch everything.
Yes, exactly.
And it's still in my queue. I haven't taken it out of my queue. All right. And then the last of the 3 questions, what's the most television moment that you've had in your life?
So at work, I am an alto in the employee choir. And as part of the performance that we do, there is some Christmas songs that are played that we don't necessarily have to sing, but their voices singing it. So we recorded them about 5 years ago, and movie nerd as well as television nerd that I am, I was incredibly amazed to find that we would be re-recording these songs at the Newman stage at the Fox studio over in Culver City. The Newman stage is named after the first of the many Newman men who have scored all kinds of movies that you have all heard of, none of which I have coming to mind right at this moment. But it felt, I'd never been on a stage like that before, but it was as if I could feel all of the other the ghost of all of the other movies that had been scored there and all the musicians that had played there, and it was magical.
I was going to say that is pretty great. I love those moments where you realize you're in someplace special, doing someplace special, and you'll sort of never match it. Yeah. And you can kind of feel the beauty of being present in that.
Okay, so those are my 3 questions. Now for yours. So let's start again with what are the 80s ladies-driven TV shows that resonated with you?
Well, there's an awful lot of 80s television that resonated with me, but I'm gonna pick my top 3.
Okay.
Which is Scarecrow and Mrs. King. One of the reasons we started this. Which I still have a lot to say about, so we'll do a few more episodes. Remington Steele, which again, one could argue started as a female-driven television show and became a male-driven television show, but it's probably a both. And then Cagney and Lacey. And not because I watched a lot of Cagney and Lacey. To be fair, as a kid, it felt very serious. It got very serious. But the idea of Cagney and Lacey existing was very resonant to me. And I loved those actresses. And I loved watching them. I didn't religiously watch that show, but that show was like, it was like, oh my God, we have our own Starsky and Hutch. Like it was, I knew it was important, but I also just liked kind of it. And it's, again, a show that visually has stayed with me, that I think was really, truly trying to be groundbreaking. And those actresses are like amazing.
Terrific. And what about currently? What is resonating with you now?
Oh, see, I should have done some research.
Oh, what's the fun of that?
That is no fun at all. Okay, so I'm just going to go with things that just are popping off the top of my head. Like, I have to say, again, Parks and Rec, even though it's not now, still stays with me. The Good Place still stays with me. And I would watch it in an instant. But in terms of just what's on now, you just start blanking on things.
Who's in it?
Just slide away. It's about the writer. It's based on her book, Shrill. Thank you. I got there. It's just like an association game. Shrill was really, like, I just finally caught up with it. And that's the thing. Now is now whenever you happen to get it into your queue.
Exactly.
Right? So I just caught up with Shrill and really enjoyed it and thought that, again, as a show that feels both progressive and feminist, which is what I would call a ladies of TV show, a TV ladies. I think that, that's right there. And there's a lot now. That's so exciting that there's like more than I can think of to name right now, which is fun. But those are the ones that are in my mind right now.
Yes, it is an embarrassment of riches right now when it comes to watching television, and it's been for several years, but continues to be impossible to watch it all.
Yes, we now have a big buffet.
Exactly. Okay, and last but not least, your own real life TV moment.
Okay, so probably one of the more dramatic moments of my life was a random thing that happened when I was driving back from Angel's Crest Forest with my boyfriend at the time, and we stopped to help this. It was getting dark. We were kind of having a little bit of a fight, but not really, but we were going to go see Dark Man. So this is 1990. We're driving back down into Glendale, and I see this woman on the side of the road. She's got a child in her arms, and she looks like she's broken down. There's a van, and it looks like she's broken down. So I pull over. He's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "She needs help." And then she runs up to our car, gets in the car, and says, "I just need to ride to the bottom of the hill." And as I pull out, I realize there's somebody chasing us from that vehicle. And ultimately, it turned out to be her husband, who was mad and drunk and had a gun.
Oh.
And ended up following us down the mountain and fired twice at my car.
Wow.
And it became this huge, very huge drama moment in which you realize it's absolutely zero fun to be in a dramatic moment like that, and is really not where you want to be, and you want it to just end. And then we were all safe when all was said and done, and he was arrested when all was said and done. And then I ended up having to go to court and testify at the grand jury. And it was a long, crazy thing that didn't necessarily end up great for me in terms of like how I felt about the whole experience. Mm-hmm. But I do remember when we did finally end up going to see Darkman that night, that I was like, it is zero fun to watch them just gunplay around this movie like it's no big deal. But that was literally driving down a dark mountain road with a angry person behind you who is drunk, according to their partner that's in your car with their child, and having them and hearing shots was one of the most dramatic moments of my life. So it was super dramatic. I don't recommend it. And we all ended up safe in that moment afterwards. So we were lucky.
I just have no words. That's incredible.
It was a weird moment. It was it made the paper.
Wow.
My boyfriend's mother called him because his name was in the paper.
Oh my gosh.
And was like, what happened? Yeah, it made the Glendale news.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm glad that everybody, got out of there in one piece.
I'm super glad. It's insane. I have never really owned any guns, and yet I've been shot at twice. That's once. But that's a story for another day. I like my drama scripted and filmed. That's what I decided.
That sounds like a bumper sticker.
All right. I want to do the little part that I'm going to call audiology, which is a little bibliography for our podcast and for what we're looking at. So first I want to tell you where to watch Scarecrow and Mrs. King, in case you want to check it out. Probably the easiest place to watch it, because they own everything, is Amazon Prime. That is probably the easiest place to watch it. You will have to purchase it. It is not part of their free video. So that's kind of a bummer. However, I highly recommend the DVDs, which are still available, which you can also find on Amazon or your DVD provider, because the quality of the sound and picture is much, much better. The Amazon streaming for 80s shows seems like a lot of people weren't paying attention to what they were doing. I mean, literally, the cropping is wrong. They're cutting off the heads of Bruce Boxleitner, and I think that is rude. He's a tall guy, but you shouldn't cut off his head. I've got a lot of the research that I did on fan sites for Scarecrow and Mrs. King, one of which is, the best of which is called Call Me a Cab. And it's at callmeacab.com, which is a line that's used in one of the later episodes. One of my favorite little exchanges between them. And she has done an amazing job of collecting materials. And she is also part of a podcast called the Mrs. King Chronicles, along with 3 other ladies who are doing episode walkthroughs. It's very fan-based. They're super adorable. And it's really funny to hear them talk about the show. So that's at mkcpodcast.com. There were 2 books I actually looked at for this show. One is called How Tall Are You? By Greg Morton, who starred in Scarecrow, Mrs. King, as the little brother. But it's he talks about being on that show and being a child actor in the 80s. And then the other show is like an academic book. And it is Television's Female Spies and Crime Fighters. 600 characters and shows, 1950s to the present, written by Karen A. Remenko. So those are our audiology for this week. There's some homework to do.
And now we want to give a shout out to our audio engineer, Kevin Ducey, co-producer Melissa Roth, plus our social media manager and production assistant, Megan McKiernan.
And a special thanks to my husband, Richard Haddam, who will be on as a guest in later episodes. He's a podcast super guest. He's been on many episodes of various podcasts, and so he had a lot of great advice for us. I want to shout out the guys from Astonishing Legends, Forrest Burgess and Scott Philbrick, a fabulous podcast about astonishing legends of supernatural phenomenon.
And our other advisors, Chris Stashew and Mike White from the Projection Booth and Culture Cast. Check out their podcast if you haven't already.
Find out more about us at our website, 80stvladies.com. That's 80stvladies.com.
Let us know if you're liking this podcast. Giving us a shout out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram really helps a lot. And through the website, you can send us an email to tell us we got something wrong.
But not too wrong. Don't yell at us. Melissa thinks you're going to yell at us. So please don't do that. I want to be right. Tell us what we got right. We hope you join us for our next episode. We're going to continue our dive into Scarecrow and Mrs. King Part 2. I know you think that we've covered all the Scarecrow and Mrs. King, but we haven't.
Not at all.
We're going to look at the first season, which is adorable and funny and really fun. We're going to talk about what went right and what we think went wrong in season 1. We're also going to look at the making of the show. We get to talk about something that's not unheard of in television production, but is still unusual. In the middle of season 1, Scarecrow and Mrs. King changed showrunners. And so we're gonna talk about that. But I want to tell you a story or two about Juanita Bartlett, the female showrunner that was brought on mid-season and would go on to run the rest of season 1 and all of season 2. She's an incredibly underrated and lesser-known showrunner who started on The Rockford Files.
We hope 80s TV Ladies brings you joy and laughter and lots of fabulous new and old TV shows to watch, all of which will lead us toward being amazing ladies of the 21st century.
I want to be an amazing lady of the 21st century, Sharon.
Me too.
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, guys.
See you soon.